Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. No engines, no libraries, it's just us and our typing fingers. Right now, we are in the middle of doing fonts, actually. Been a long time coming, a lot of people have asked when we're going to do fonts, and we are doing fonts. We've got fonts on the screen, actually. They look just fine, but there's some things that we have not finished yet that we need to finish. And really the biggest one is called kerning, which we discussed a little bit earlier. And today is pretty much going to be all about kerning so that we can get our font's horizontal spacing looking nicer than it looks right now. If you would like to follow along at home and you pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, today is day 170, so please unpack day 169 source code into a directory. That is the source code that I will be starting with today. And it is the source code that you will want to start with so that you can follow along at home. I'll go ahead and bring this up. Let me get my Emacs window. So if you take a look at where we left things on Friday, we had just finished getting our baseline stuff working so that our fonts are nicely lined up on the screen. You can kind of see that everything lines up very nicely along that baseline like we would want it to, typographically speaking. But we do not have a bunch of other things we might like to have working with our fonts. Namely, our horizontal spacing is now just based on the bitmap. We don't have any information about how letters should go together. Like this C, for example, looks too far from the I compared to how the U is set up. Stuff like that, like you'd want it to be a little bit closer. Same with this T and this U, for example. A lot of places where you have two pieces extending, right? It's setting them up the way that they should be based on the bitmap widths, but really the way typographers do it is they let things sort of come into each other's space, right? They let them kind of interpenetrate a little when you have, when the two things don't line up, right? When you have a thing like this where two things line up, then it's fine to like sort of line them up with the bitmap widths. But when you have things where the like furthest extent to the left of one character and the furthest extent to the right of another character don't line up, you typically want to sort of push them a little closer together. It just looks and reads a little bit nicer. So we want to do that. We want to fix that for sure. And then there's also a few other sort of leftover text metrics we'd also like to have, such as the line spacing. You can look and see this P and this L, right? When you have a descender and an ascender, you can kind of see how we don't leave the right amount of space. That's because all we did for this test routine was just arbitrarily pick some amount of pixels to advance to put the next font, to put the next line in. And what we'd really rather do is read that information out of the font itself so that we know how much line spacing there's supposed to be and so that it works with any font. So we'd like to do all those things. And so let's get started on that. So first things first, let's take a look at that font routine. Let's take a look at how we were drawing that font, right? We had that debug text line. And if you take a look at what happened in here, it was all very straightforward. We added some fun things in here, like people wanted like being able to switch for the colors of the lines and stuff like that. But if you take a look at the actual meat of the code, this stuff is just for changing colors and scales and stuff by using embedded code and weird stuff like that. Really the only part of this code that matters at all is just this right here, right? It's just the code in this loop, in this part of the loop, where we go ahead and say find whatever the font is, find whatever the character glyph is that we're trying to draw. Go ahead and figure out how big it is and where it should be and draw it, right? That's the entirety of like what we actually have to do. And we've already sort of mentioned the fact that one thing that we'd like to do is get the line spacing to be correct. The line spacing would just be replacing this ad hoc line here, where we just got a random 1.2 times 80, like, whatever that is, right? Get rid of that and replace it with some actual real value that we know is the line spacing. So that's one thing that we would want to do. And that's pretty easy. That's just one value. But the more complicated thing is we want this part right here, where we actually have the @x advance, right? This char_dim value. Where we advance the horizontal spacing, what we'd like to do is actually have something there that advances the spacing differently depending on the pair of characters rather than just on one character. We talked about this before when I did Introduction to Fonts. It's called kerning. And what kerning is it's setting different advancements depending on a pair of characters instead of just a constant advancement or an advancement per character, right? Because right now we're actually advancing a different amount per character potentially, right? If a character's width is smaller, we advance by less. So we're actually sort of doing a proportionally spaced font at this point, right? And in fact, you could see this if I was to switch which font we were using. And let me just go ahead and do that just to underscore what the difference between a proportional spacing and a kerned spacing are, because they're actually not necessarily the same thing. I mean, the terminology is a little fuzzy there, so it's unclear what you're really referring to, but I just want to underscore that there's two different ways you could think of it, right? So let's say we're here in the asset processor, and we switch back to Arial. So instead of using Courier New, which is a less, it's sort of more of a fixed width, it's supposed to be more of a fixed width font, let's say we go ahead and do that sort of proportional font as the font that we're going to have in the game, right? So now when we run, we're going to have Arial instead, okay? And what you can see very clearly when you look at this is we are totally already supporting a proportional font, because the distance that we advance for every character is drastically different. The distance, the spacing on this T is much different than the spacing on this U, right? This U advances much wider than this T advances much narrower, right? So we are already supporting proportionally spaced fonts. What we're not supporting is kerning. And what kerning is moving a sort of a font designer tweaked amount. Because like the classic case right here, this 2 is a very obvious one, right? You can see right in the space of this T, what a font designer would do is it would reduce these two gaps here dramatically, right? So even though right now it's perfectly flush, like this O, the first character of this O starts right where this one leaves off, and the first character of this T the first pixel of this T starts right where this last character of the P leaves off. So we're totally obeying a proportional font rule there. But what we're not obeying is the fact that when there are different shapes of letters, sometimes you want the spacing to be more or less because it looks better. It has nothing to do with how big the character is. That's not what it's about. It's about how the different pieces of those character glyphs line up with each other, and so it's about the pair of characters. If this right here was another uppercase T, we wouldn't want them to be closer together. So it's about the fact that it's a lowercase p and an uppercase T, and it's that pairwise spacing that's the important part. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. So how do we do that, right? Well, like I said when we were talking about kerning originally, it's really not a big deal. People were asking whether I was going to support proportional fonts and all this sort of thing. I get this impression that some people think that's a big deal. It's not a big deal. As you already saw, getting a proportional space font is trivial. It just means instead of incrementing add x by a constant value, instead you would increment it by a value that changes per bitmap. That we did. So we already got proportional there. It was trivial, right? It is a literally one line change in the code, right? You're just adding in, instead of making this a constant somewhere, you're just making it based on the width of the character, okay? It's very, very, very straightforward. That's the only difference between a fixed width font and a proportional font. That's all, right? Now, in order to take that up to kerning, which is one level above, again, very, very straightforward. We are not going to change this routine pretty much at all. We're going to do exactly the same thing that we've been doing. The only difference is that amount that we advance now has to be based on both the current character and the previous character, right? So what we want to do here is we want to store, we've got these code points, right? What we want to do is we want to store the previous code point, right? We want to have here a notion of what the previous code point was. We'll initialize it to 0, saying no code point. And then when we come in here, every time we output one of these characters, what we will do is we will save whatever that code point was. We will remember, right, whatever that code point actually was. Okay, so we'll keep that previous code point. So then what we would know is we'd know both the current code point and the previous code point, right? And we could even do this a little bit more sort of opaquely here. We could do something where we want to, sort of formalize this notion of a code point a little bit, just to make things easier on ourselves later if we want to support international languages and things like this, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and pull that out and call that the code point here. Really very simple. So if I pull that out there, so now we've got the code point and we've got the previous code point, like so. Just going to go ahead and compile this, right? Right, there we go. Previous code point. I thought I had that here. Oh, just my capitalization there. There we go. So if I do it like that, now you can see nothing has changed, right? Same exact routine. Nothing's different. The only difference now is I've set myself up for actually getting what I need, which is that this thing right here, right, which is the kerning amount, is going to be something that we look up now, right? It's going to be something different. We're not going to save this anymore. This kerdim thing is not going to be used, right? We're going to get rid of that. And what we're going to do instead, and you know what, we could even do something a little bit fancier if we wanted to here. We could do something like this where we say, okay, our kerning, right, or our advance x equals something, which we don't know what it is yet, and we'll do our advance x there. And that way, if we want to, we can always go back to setting it up to use proportional. So we can switch between the two modes just so you can see the difference between them, which might be a little bit interesting, I think, right? All right, so we've set ourselves up like this, right? And again, if I just do this, we're back to the same, right? I haven't changed routine at all. I'm just kind of like fussing with it. I'm just like moving it into a slightly different position than it was in originally, right? So now if I want to, I can comment that out and say we're not going to set advanced x that way anymore. What we're going to do instead is set advanced x based on some kind of kerning, right? What I want to do now is I want to be able to ask for the kerning, the proper amount of kerning, for sort of these two code points that I have. I want to say like get horizontal advance for pair or something, right? And I want to say I want to know what the horizontal advance is between the code point that I'm on, right, and the code point that came before it. Make sense, right? And furthermore, I think what I'd like to do, I mean, now that I think about this, I kind of want to phrase this in the reverse way, I think, because when we start out, you wouldn't want to advance at all, which we could handle by just saying that, well, when the code point, whatever the code point 0 is, we'll just have no advancement or something like that. But the interesting thing is that when I actually do this, the advancement, I would want to pre-advance, right? I'd want to pre-advance it like that, which makes it a little harder to keep the old method here. You know what I mean? Because I want to advance between the previous and the current like so. So, yeah. Hard to say, right? What I could do instead, if I wanted to, is I could do something where I look at the next code point, right? And then do that. But if I do that, then it becomes harder for people who want to do this kind of nonsense where you parse things out of the string and use them. So I don't know. I guess maybe I just give this up and say, you know what? It's not going to happen. Sorry, my friend. And what we will actually do is always do our advancing previous, at the head end, right, basically. And so that seems like a little bit better to me. That seems like a little bit more what I want. And so I'm going to do it like that. And then when we compile, all of our code will just work at this point. The only thing is we just don't know what that actual value is going to be. Now, obviously, in order to get the horizontal advance, we're going to need some different things. First of all, I'm going to have to scale by whatever it is that I'm scaling everything else by, right? Because we're all of the font stuff is stored in some space, like whatever the dimensions in the font are and all that stuff in pixels or whatever. We're scaling that by however much we want to scale the font, right? So we're going to store our kerning in that same space, obviously. That just makes sense. So in the asset file, all the kerning information should be stored in the same way as any other number in the font system. That's just, just the same way to do it. So when we do this, we're going to need one other piece of information, which is which actual font we're talking about. And this is sort of gets into the final piece, which is like I said, is moving our asset system up a notch, like adding the notion of having these different fonts so that we can more quickly access the data that we need to access in them, right? So what I would like to do is I'd like to have some way of having, because you'll notice I have this thing here which says this is too slow for text at the moment. I'd like to have some way of sort of having a centralized piece of font information, because I'm going to have this kerning information. We know that. I would like to have something faster for looking up the glyphs than going through the whole matching system every time we want to render a character. That seems like a bad idea. And furthermore, I'd like to have some place to store that information like the line height, which we just don't have at the moment, right? And so those are a bunch of things that's what I would like to start having. So what I think I really want to do, right, is I want to be able to get a font, an actual concept of a font, back from my asset system, right? I want to have something where I can do, asset or font, something like this. And it's a first-class citizen out here in the whole asset thing. We're in here, we just have these, and they're not going to be demand loaded. The bitmaps will be demand loaded, but we can actually just have them, as a separate adjunct thing that gets loaded as part of the giant block load, right? We could totally do it that way. And there's really nothing particularly stopping us from doing that as far as I can think of. And so what I'd like to do, like I said, is just go ahead and start expanding that out. So in here, we would have something like, in addition to the asset counts and the asset types, we would also have something here that would just be, our font, right? And you know what? Now that I think about it, we could actually use the asset system to do matching, where we just put in what we kind of the characteristics of a font that we want, and out it would come. And so maybe we even want to go that far. Like maybe we want to make that happen as well. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. It may not, but it's something that we could consider. And if we did go that route, then things would be a little bit weird because it does mean that we would have stuff like our fonts would have to actually be tracked as part of the loading and all that sort of stuff, which I just don't know how important that is. I don't know. I do not know what I think about that. I'm okay with it. Maybe let's just go down that route and we'll see what happens. And that way fonts can be as big as they want and they won't get loaded unless they're actually being used. Seems okay. The downside of it is it means that any code that needs to work with the font can't necessarily... see, this is the part I don't like. Any code that's going to do operations on the font, like laying out where the characters have to go, can't actually run until the font is actually paged in, right? So I don't know how I feel about that. On the other hand, if we have lots of different fonts, if we have different fonts for different languages or stuff like that, could get a little hairy, right? Having all of those things always loaded, like always having to load the kerning tables for every language font, does seem a little bit annoying. It's tricky, right? I mean, it's a little bit tricky, I feel like. I'm gonna go for it. I'm going for it. Sometimes you can't make a decision. Sometimes there's no way to make an informed decision, so you just go for it. So I'm gonna say that we have some kind of a loaded font thing here. I'm just gonna say we've got that. And then what we do is we say, okay, we've got this loaded font. We want to get our font. And that's the only thing that gets type matched, right? That's the only thing that we actually do sort of have the match vector for, right? And so what we do here is we'd say, okay, we want to go ahead and get our font back. So we'd have, in fact, this stuff up here would now actually be exactly for that. So we'll have the match vector and the weight vector. We'd say, go ahead and get us the best font. So I guess we'd say something like, font ID. Oh, yeah, okay. I see how this is going. This might not be so bad. Get best match font, right? What did I call this? Bitmap from, so it's font from, right? We pass that asset system. We say that we want an asset font, which is exactly what we do want, in fact. And then we pass our vectors. And right now we don't really have anything to pick from. I suppose we'll have like a debug font sort of concept, or I don't know, something like this. Hard to say. So anyway, we do our get our best match font and whatnot. And then down in here, we would get rid of this notion. So it would just be our code point would be something relatively direct, right? And we would assume that we could actually get our font out as well. So what we do here is we'd say something like get font, right? because we have, these sort of query routines where we do get sound, get so on, right? So we'd have a loaded font, and we'd call get font. We would pass the assets for that, like so. And we'd also need our generation ID for that guy as well. So I think that'd just be our render group's generation ID, right? Like so. So when we get the font, we would pass it the font ID. That would either get us back a font or wouldn't, depending on whether it's loaded. So assuming that it actually is loaded, if the font is loaded, then we can proceed with doing what we would like to do. If not, then obviously we can't. This feels like this should be there, yes. So that's all good. So that looks fine to me. I think I could live with that. I think I'm okay with that. And so, again, what I'm going to do here is just say what I want this thing to do. I'm just going to say I'm going to pass you a font and some code points. You're going to tell me what the horizontal advancement is. I'm just going to assume that we can make that happen. We are, we are bright and capable programmers who will make that occur. And so we've got a code point here. We were previously putting in a match vector and having get bitmap info pull that out. What I'd rather do is say that we've got that bitmap ID now is going to come from a direct lookup inside the font. So we do get bitmap for glyph, right? And we would pass it the code point, right? Something like this. There's some extra stuff in there that I would like to sort of look at a little bit later as well, but point being. So what I'd like to do is get that bitmap back there, and then assuming that we get back that bitmap ID from the thing, we can then get it the info and continue, right? So we've kind of just stubbed out. We've, again, I'm following the write the usage code first methodology here. I'm just trying to make it so that everything makes reasonable sense. Don't actually remember where we were defining those ID, like sound ID and so on. I have no idea where those are actually defined, to be honest with you. This is the problem of maintaining, working in 3 code bases at once. I guess I do our game at Molly, the witness, and this one. I start to forget where everything is. Anyway, so I'd like to do struct sound ID. I don't remember how to make this actually find those as a group. It doesn't. It's some kind of weird thing where it considers them multiple things. Oh, you know what? I can probably just backslash the space. Does that work? Can I do this? There we go. So if I want to get my struct sound ID, here they are in Handmade file formats. So what I'd like is, for sound ID, I'd like there to be a font ID, right, that is similar, that also can be retrieved, right? And so now, assuming that I do this, I can get all of this other stuff that I want starting to be stubbed out. And so in handmade asset.h, I can start to sort of make these actual routines. They should be relatively straightforward, right? So if I'm calling get sound, for example, I should be able to call instead the same thing on a font, right? I should be able to say get font, pass it a font ID and a generation ID, and then when I get that asset back, I'm just going to only look at the font part of it instead of the sound part of it, and that's really all there is to it, right? Then inside that loaded font, we'll just assume are all the things that we actually want, which we're going to go over figuring out what those are in a second here. And they're just going to be based on these routines. Now, while I'm at it, because I'm being greedy, I might as well, right, also say that we can go ahead and get that line advancement as well, right? If the font comes back okay, I should be able to do something where I just say, okay, what's the line advance, right? So I just say get line advance for this font. And as long as I multiply it by the font scale, there we go. Now, font scale, char scale, all that stuff looks about right. So I'm satisfied with that, I think. So now if we compile this, you can see we've essentially got 4 different sort of things we want the font to be able to answer. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of stub those out here and start to see what I actually need. What will I need in terms of data to answer these questions, right? What if I'm going to answer these questions for the application? that's what I want to see, right? And again, this is just following that, right? The usage code first, push down kind of methodology, kind of a top-down methodology that I'm taking here because I know what I want. I don't necessarily know what I need to do to implement it, so I'm coming from the thing I know and going towards the thing I don't know, which is always the best way to work. If you're relatively certain that your code on one side is correct, it's pretty easy to kind of just push downward from there, right? So if I come through here and start implementing these guys out, I can start to see what they're going to look like, right? Like so, right? And so assuming that these take loaded fonts, so someone's already done the lookup. Excuse me. Oh, this guy is a little bit different, isn't he? So this guy's going to be slightly different. So I'm going to move that guy potentially up into a different point. But anyway, these guys we know exactly how what they're taking and what they're going to return here. So for the moment, I'll just go ahead and say, oh yeah, the horizontal advancement is just 10 pixels. I don't know, right? And the line or 50, let's say 80 pixels. We'll say I think we had randomly 80 in there for a bunch of stuff. I think we had 1.2f times 80 in there. Just have random values that are totally garbage for now. And then this get best match font from, that we need to go put up with the asset system probably. The other asset system calls. We also have got this guy, which I for some reason didn't copy in here. Let's go ahead and put him in there. So there we go. We've got the loaded font and code point, like so. And so we could even sort of stub these out a little bit by, we could even make these use the old thing that they were using before, right? You could imagine us doing something absurd in here, but yeah, I don't know that I necessarily want to do that. But we could do something like, you know what, we're just going to take font ID. I don't even know. Loaded font. Don't try this at home, kids. Do not try this at home. We could do something like this. I know it looks ridiculous. We could do something like this at the moment and just actually have this thing still do the exact lookup just so we can make sure the code is slotted in properly. Not really that important. I'm not super worried about this, but just to show that we could, just to make sure we've got the stuff we need. So if we're getting the bitmap ID for the glyph here, I don't know if we're really going to need the assets or not. We're probably not. So I don't know, but I guess we should probably have it one way or the other in case it does need to do lookup in something. That might be a good idea. So I think maybe I will add that to the call. Just looking at it, it's like, yeah, I could see maybe we want the assets in there. That seems fair. So if we do the get best match bitmap from, and I'll do the match vector e tag code point. What was the name of that? File formats. Unicode code point. So close. Right? All right, so if we do our weight vector and our match vector, the match vector's got to match that code point. And then we could still do this exact same thing. Right. And now I think our code is compiling or close to compiling. Okay, probably should actually make that be something reasonable. Asset ID, and then we've got font vector. So this is an asset vector, match, and weight. Right. Okay, get best match asset from asset type ID. That is what I actually meant. There we go. Initializing. Oh, you can. Trust me, you can. It's all good. And that returns a font ID? Oh. Huh. Oh, right. Never mind. So we could have just saved ourselves the trouble here and done that. Never mind. There we go. Like so. Yeah, and so then all we really have to do now is we just have to make it so that the other function is stubbed as well. So in our inline here, where you actually get the font, we would have to sort of cheat at that. We'd have to do something like this, where we say loaded font. Star result equals loaded font 1. There we go. So now we're still working, right, in a kind of crazy way. And as you can see, we're always advancing by the exact same size everywhere, right? Because we're just hard-coded with that returns. But we're still wired up properly. So all we really need to do now to get things working is to actually go implement these routines. And we know that once we implement the routines, we'll be in good shape, right? We know that everything's kind of getting returned properly and that we're all set up. So let's go ahead and pull these things out one by one. So let the get font actually call through to get the font. And then let's start to implement these guys here, right? So get best match bitmap from just does this. So I'm going to call the exact same thing for the font, because really these are just very simple thunk functions that just kind of, all they do is make it so that you have to pass the right type to the asset ID thing, which is really pretty basic. So this should be totally fine. We're just passing exactly all this stuff all the way through. And so really we don't really need anything fancier than just that straightforward thing. So I'm just going to stick that there, and that's all good. Match vector and weight vector. And so that's all taken care of. And now we're going to have to start actually going and editing the asset file format to include these things that we actually want, right? So in here, let's pretend we actually have what we want. I'm going to do the simple version first, and then we're going to do a slightly more complicated version after that. But all I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, OK, we've got handmade hero asset.h. Up in that loaded font, I'm going to assume that I have a code point count and a code point min, something like this. And that we basically have some kind of a range of code points, right? In fact, at the beginning, you know what? Let's not even do that. At the beginning, let's just say we've got a code point count, because that'll be fine for ASCII. When we start trying to think about, do we want to handle kanji or something, right? Maybe not such a good idea. But at the moment, we can just say, OK, we've got a code point count, and then we've got a bitmap ID for the code points, right? So the bitmap IDs are just all in that code point table, right? So that's fine. We then have, in addition, we need the horizontal advancement, right? So we need horizontal advance. And that's going to be a two-dimensional table, right? It's going to look up on two different things. But that's relatively easy to do as well. And then we also need a line advance, and that's just one thing, right? So we need something that looks like that. That's what we need in our actual loaded font. And so then if we were actually going to use that, it's pretty trivial, right? We just say the result is the font line advance. Very straightforward. In this case, it's slightly more difficult, 2D array lookup, but still totally trivial. We're just going to look up into the horizontal advance. And the way that we would look up into that horizontal advance is we would just say, OK, we've got however many code points there are, right? Our previous code point, let's say, times the code point count, plus the code point standard 2D array referencing, right? We all know how to do this by now. We've done it a million times. So we're just taking a two-dimensional index, one for the prev code point, which is in this case, and one for the code point, standard 2D array indexing. We go ahead and return that. Simple 2D array index and done. And then in here, what we have now is we've already got a code point array. So now we can just go ahead in here and say the font has the code points in it. So whatever the code point is, we just look it up directly. And now it's not that kind of annoying. Remember I said it was really going to be slow before. Now we're not running some kind of a search match. We just look up directly. What's the bitmap ID? We get it back. We're done, right? So that's way better. Okay, so now one of the things that's true about this is we probably want to clamp these guys, right? We probably don't want to be doing stuff that's out of range for what we have. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce the concept here where I'm just going to say, well, there's like a desired code point that I'm asking for, and then there's the code point that I'm actually going to get, right? And normally it's going to be the desired code point, but only if the desired code point's actually in range. So if the desired code point is less than the code point count for the font, then I'm cool with it, right? Otherwise, we're just going to give you back the 0 bitmap because you're trying to draw a glyph we don't have, right? And maybe the 0th code point is always going to be mapped to bitmap 0 so that you don't draw anything, right? Who knows? Point being, I want to clamp that, right? And similarly, I'd like to do that here. And you can kind of see that those are going to be very similar. So what I'd rather do is just have a thing that's like get clamped code point, something like this, so that I can pass these two things into it and get back a result, right? And so what that's going to do is that's going to do this exact clamp that we just did. Excuse me. Like so. And so that allows me to just say, okay, I know now that I can just always do these clamp things. So anything that comes in, I can clamp and then use, right? Very, very straightforward. And same thing here. Prev code point is going to be equal to get clamp code point, desired prev code point. Code point is going to be equal to get clamped code point. I guess we, yeah, well, desired code point. So, and that way, again, the lookup will always succeed and always work okay, even if we're getting out of range requests, which is entirely likely on fonts. So I don't want to have that be a crash scenario. I'd rather have that be handled gracefully because it's the kind of thing that might be happening and it's okay. All right, so that's all I really wanted to have happen there. You need to pass the font. And now I do. And that's about all there is to it, right? Very straightforward. That is literally all the code we actually need at runtime, right? Because what I've essentially done is said, you know what? I just want all of this information to be tabulated so that I can just straight up look it up and I don't have to worry later about calculating things or figuring things out. I want it all just to be there as a quick index. So once I get that font handle back, that's the only slow query. The only slow query is give me the loaded font. Everything else is like a direct table lookup and it doesn't have to go through anything fancy because that, if we have lots of characters on the screen, we don't want to constantly be doing all these queries to find them. We want to just know where's the character, here it is, right? So now, although it's very easy to write that code because we basically said we want everything tabulated, we now have to actually go and build those tables, right? Which is, that's work right there, right? But hey, let's go ahead and do that. It won't be that hard. The first thing that we're probably going to need to do, and we'll go ahead and do that in Handmade file formats. The first thing that we want to do is we need to introduce the fact that there's a difference between a font and a font glyph, right? Because our font glyphs are going to be different range of bitmap IDs than our fonts, which are now actual citizens, right? So we kind of have two different things. Now, do we really need a font glyph asset type range? Probably not, but we might as well just have one in there. And then font itself, of course, is going to be specific to the actual, font information. Okay. So if we do that, yeah. Again, we're never really going to use this to look anything up because we're going to be looking up the fonts indirectly through the tables, but I just kind of thought it would be nice to have it marked in the file so that it's clear what is a font glyph and what isn't, right? So now we have to store these things, right? And we know exactly what we need to store. We know we need to store this information. So far, and maybe some more stuff, we might want to store a couple other things with it, but that's basically what we're dealing with here, right? That's what we want That's what we want to have. So if we go ahead and look into this loaded font, we're going to want to sort of augment what we're storing here so that when a font is stored as an asset, it's in the file as something intelligent, right? So we've got HHA bitmap, we've got HHA sound. We now need an HHA font, which has some of this additional information in it, right? And we started 20 minutes late today, so I'm definitely going to take the extra time on the clock because this is all pretty rote code that's obviously, as you've seen, very simple to write. So we might as well kind of push through it and get as much of it done as we can so that we're in the best possible position for tomorrow. All right. So I've got my HHA font. I know that I need this information, right? I know this is what I need. But if you take a look at what happens here, obviously I've got two different arrays and so on. So I can just basically say, well, okay, normally like a bitmap and things like that, they've got sort of the data offset thing where they go and load their data. That's a late loaded thing. What I could do is just say for us, it's not late loaded. For fonts, it's loaded immediately at the time when you kind of open. I could do that. Or I guess, now that I think about it, we said that it wouldn't be. So I guess we're going to have that be actually in the data section, right? So basically all we're going to put here is what the code point count is and what the line advance is, I guess, because those are the two values that we actually could just store that aren't large. And then we're just going to assume that our data offset's going to point to an array of bitmap IDs and then a 2D array of horizontal advancements, right? So I guess we could say data is, right? Code point count, and like so, right? And I'll mention this because people often ask me this question on the stream. I'll just mention it. I'm going to try and start mentioning it more often now because people have been asking. A lot of times I talk about how a lot of stuff like C++ is bad and Java's bad and all this sorts of stuff, like don't do them. And that's all true. But that's not the same thing as saying that C is good. Okay? And so I just want to point out, for example, this sort of thing is stuff that should totally be automatically generated. And in a better language, it would be. And the problem is, in order to get those functionalities out of other languages, you have to take on a bunch of stuff you don't want, right? C++, C#, Java, etc. They don't make it easy to do what you actually want to do. They force you to incur all this baggage. And that's what I don't like, right? So the way that I typically handle these kinds of problems, if I wasn't doing a game like Handmade Hero where the goal is to kind of teach the ground up programming, is the fundamentals, right? The way that I typically handle these is these are meta-generated. So I will typically do generation that generates file formats so that it can automatically do stuff like, oh, how many arrays did you want? Okay, we'll pack them together, that sort of stuff, right? Very, very simple. It's trivial to do, right? You just write a program that generates C code, right? But it's kind of a level above. And it's not something that I want to show on Handmade Hero because everyone should do this first. You should do one game this way first. Because if you don't know how to do it this, you'll never know how to write the meta code right. That's the big thing. And so you got to do it once this way. But once you've done it once this way, you will see for yourself how you like to arrange these things. And then you'll be able to pull out those common things into a meta-generated version if you so choose. Now on Handmade Hero, we're not going to have a lot of it, so you would, my argument would almost be that you wouldn't bother on Handmade Hero anyway, because the amount of time it would take you to go do the generation stuff is probably going to be longer than the amount of time you would save. But if you're taking the longer view, like I'm going to build an engine, I'm going to build lots of games with it, blah, 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 then it becomes clear that it's easier to invest in that time because now you have more flexibility and you can do many games with it and so on and so forth, right? So it's always about trade-offs. It's always about making the right judgment call about what's the right thing to build and what are the trade-offs and so on. But I do want to point it out that, yeah, do I always write all this stuff by hand? No. I've got a lot of techniques for making sure that I don't have to write it by hand. But the key part is the way that I choose to handle that is not by going to a crappy language like Java, where I then take on all this baggage and my code is slow and lousy. I don't have to do that, right? I can still get all the benefits of C, and I just fix the parts that are actually broken, which is the fact that I don't want to have to write stuff like this every time, where now I have to manually sort of figure out how my array is packed in the file, right? And so that's kind of the important thing to understand, is that, yes, C has tons of limitations. Unfortunately, the higher level languages don't fix them. They just exchange them for other problems. And so if you really want to get past that point, I recommend be a Jedi, build your own lightsaber. Don't go taking this sort of like targeting computer approach to stuff. It doesn't work. You're never going to get it into the exhaust port that way. Anyway, so moving on from that brief digression. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say that the data for these guys is this. And I could go ahead and augment these guys here as well to just make a quick note about what the data is. So in this case, data is channels 0, channel count, sample count, right? That's the way we chose to store that. So it's kind of saying this is what goes in the data. Same with HH bitmap. We know what that is. That's a U32 of the pixels with dim 0 and dim 1, right? So that's just me kind of making a note that's like, hey, yeah, if this was a good programming language that was like super modern and amazing, I would have been able to meta-program this so I can just say that and then the file format works or something. It's not, but it's still a trusty language. So I'm going to go write it myself the way I want it written, and it will let me do that, and that's awesome. But I do want to make note of, for people who are trying to read it, that's what you're actually seeing, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and go over to the actual implementation of this stuff, right? First thing I want to do is I want to figure out how I'm going to actually load that stuff, right? Because if you look here, when we do load asset work directly, we kind of have a problem there, which is that when we do that load asset work, we don't have a problem. We just set up the pointers ahead of time. That's how we always did stuff, so that should be fine. So yeah. So this will actually work the same. So if we take a look at load bitmap, it's pretty much should be the same as load sound, and that should all be totally fine, right? So we should be able to go ahead and grab like one of these guys here, and then we should be able to sort of do our own version of this for loading fonts, which won't presumably be particularly difficult. We could come in here, we do our standard atomic exchange and add. And one thing that's a little bit annoying, I will point out, is I feel like this little bit of boilerplate here is a little risky. To do, Casey, merge this boilerplate. Because it's a delicate little atomic thing. Like I feel like we wanted that collapse so that if we change it in one place, we don't try to, accidentally forget to change it for each of the loading calls. You know what I mean? There's too much shared code happening here that's not actually being shared. And that makes me a little bit nervous, and so that's something that I would like to address in the future if we have a chance to do so. It's not the end of the world, but it would make me feel more comfortable if we did. So anyway, moving on. So if I have my load font call here, basically everything is the same. The only difference is going to be that when I actually do the sort of pointer stuff remapping here, I obviously need to, set up the pointers in that loaded font, right? So in here, if I had my loaded font, like so, then I know that I have to set, again, this is totally on rails here, right? I'm just following the footprint that I already laid down for myself. Very, very, very straightforward, right? So let's go ahead and do this, right? And you know what? I mean, now that I look at this, right? We can even make this even simpler, right? The code point count is really the only thing that we really need. The line advance doesn't really even have to be there, honestly. I mean, we could simplify that by having a font header. I don't know that we need to do that, so maybe we don't bother. And really, those could come out of the HHA font, and probably should. That's how we've kind of been doing it. So really, it's more we want just that almost. So it's a little bit tricky. So I'm gonna go full pull. I'm voting for full pull here. And so if we take a look at what that implies, it basically, I'm saying that the HHA font would have something additional at the head, which is just like an HHA font info or something like that, right? Or font header, something like that, that it would have on the front. And that HHH font header would actually have, it would actually be a sort of a data piece for that font, right? So it would have the line advance. It would have maybe the the baseline, the ascenders, the descenders we could have to do, you know, anything else we want, right? And so I feel like that's a better thing to do almost than this, because the only piece of information we actually need for a font is the code point count. That's it. We don't need anything else. Everything else can just be loaded. And so what I'd like to do is sort of change that up a bit. I'd like to go ahead and say that we have that font header, and maybe it's the info. I don't know. Font info, font header, meh. It's difficult to really say. Like the chain, for example, the chain value. Do we want to do this or do we not? I'm torn. I'm really torn, right? All right, fine. I'll stick with convention. So far, we haven't been doing that. We could just put the font header in there. We won't do that. We're going to leave it this way. So that's fine. What that means, though, too, is the loaded font, to keeping with convention, would only have these two things in it, because you would call getFontInfo to get the HHA font back, and that's already got your stuff in it. So we'll change that up to work a little bit slightly differently, right? But anyway, so inside the font itself, we would have the HHA font here, like so. So we'd have the font info. And then what we would do is we're going to set up the loaded font code points and the horizontal advance, right? And these are going to be really, really simple, right? All that's going to happen here is the data immediately after the header, right? Is going to be where the first table is, right? You can kind of see the way we were doing it here, right? The memory for the bitmap is just whatever is immediately after the header. So that's the same thing we're going to do here. When this stuff gets loaded in, it's going to get loaded into that memory slot. So we're just going to go ahead and say, all right, the code points are the first thing after the header, and then the horizontal advance is the first thing after the code points, right? And the code point size, really, in order to do that, it's again really, really basic. We know that the code points are going to be the size of a bitmap ID, so we know that they're that big, and we know how many code points there are because we stored that in the info, which we always have. That's why I was saying that's the only thing that we need, is because we need to know how many, right? How many we have, so we know how to unpack those arrays. That's it, right? That's all there is. So yeah, there's really nothing else to it. Really, really straightforward. Really, really straightforward. And you can see how common all this code is, so I really feel like we need to merge this. Merge all this boilerplate. Same between load bitmap, load sound, and load font. Because now it's just that internal, it's just that little core that changes, and so we can do a better job for sure. Okay, continuing on, we need to do our size computation here, and I don't actually know. It looks like really all we need to do is remember what the size of the data actually is. So we really just need to compute this stuff out. Pretty straightforward. Size section is irrelevant, so I'm going to get rid of this notion altogether. I'm just going to say here that we've got size data and size total, and then we'll just use those because that's kind of an antiquated thing, that struct. We kind of got rid of it, right? And so the size data, we know how big that's going to be, right? I guess, and this is the place where I should have just done code points size, because I can now just go, okay, code point size equals that. So then I know the size of the data is going to be the code point size plus the size of the horizontal advance. And that's going to be the total size of my font. Right? So we've got horizontal advance size. That's just going to be the size of an R32 times the code point count squared, right? Because it's a 2D lookup. So that's it. That's all there is. And then the rest of this routine will just load the font. And everybody wins. Everyone wins, as it turns out. But we've got a lot more work to do, and we're running out of time. We only have about 6 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure things are compiling here, at least. And then we will have to sort of maybe quickly fix a few things to leave ourselves in a semi-running state. We won't be able to leave ourselves in a completely running state today because we've made too many changes, but that's okay. Rarely can you get all your changes in an hour. It's surprising how many times we are actually able to do that on Handmade Hero, but you know, that's not the norm. Normally, big changes, they take a while. All right, so yeah, looking good so far. I don't see any problems. And so now we have to do, again, these are going to be when we do get clamped code point and stuff like that. When we're passing the loaded font, we actually need the font info here for those, which is a slightly different thing again. What that means is that these guys kind of all need, in addition, the HHA font, right? They need that. It may not be savory. You know, it's a little ugly. But that's just how it goes sometimes, right? You got to pass both things. That's okay. Not really a problem. And we could always copy it in if we want to, but I'm going to leave it this way for now because why not? That's the way the things we're working in. I'm fine with that for now. So let's see. Get bitmap for glyph. That's going to need both as well. HHA font info, like so. And yeah. This one doesn't actually need the loaded font at all at the moment. It just needs the info. So that means we got to push those changes back up one level, and the compiler will do that for us automatically, right? We'll be here. And what that means is we're going to want that font info. So we're going to want HHA font info, get font info. And again, that's just going to be a really straightforward call to get that font info. And now, when we come through here, we're actually passing both of these, right? Same thing here. And this guy only needs one, right? And I guess for good measure, I'll have that guy take both just to give us the option a little bit later on of not, you know, so we don't, you know, have everyone not have that and think they can get a line advance. We'll make that happen anyway. So then we need to get font info. That's, again, pretty straightforward. We already have the get bitmap info stuff, right? Get bitmap info. And so we just need a get font info that's going to sort of mirror those guys. So that produces that HHA font that we wanted. There's get font info. And there we go. All done. All good. So now if we actually try to run, we're just going to explode because we totally changed the asset file layout. Like, stuff's going to go nuts, right? Or not. How does... Every time I say stuff's going to break, it doesn't break. Every time. Suppose I should be happy. What can you do? It didn't break. All right, well, I don't know what to say about that. We've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the test asset processor. So if we're in the test asset processor here, you can imagine sort of what we're going to have to do differently when we come through and do our fonts, right? We're going to kind of have to restructure this a little bit. And I guess I won't start that. That'll be what we'll start on tomorrow, is we'll do that. So you know what? I'm not even going to talk about it. We'll talk about all the stuff that we have to do to fix that tomorrow. So, all right, we're just going to leave things broken, and we'll fix them starting tomorrow. We'll go to the Q&A, and yeah. So if you have questions about what we coded, please go ahead and send them to me with Q: in front of them, and we should be good to go. Did you run the asset builder? No, we don't really want to run the asset builder. That's only going to make things worse because we haven't updated it yet, right? So that'll probably put us in a bad situation, right? I'm guessing. Oh, no, it's okay. I'm a little surprised at that. But yeah, we don't store those font tables yet, so we have to go write the font tables, and then we'll be done. So tomorrow we'll write the font tables out, and then we might be done with. Well, you know what? We probably want to spend a day or two on supporting more languages, on language support, even if it's just rudimentary, just so we know that we've got a story about how we could translate the game into Chinese or something, right? I mean, the artist on the game is Chinese. We should at the very least support Chinese, right? Cube or Caleb, missed part of the stream. Can you give context on why you want the metaprogramming thing? Sure. It's just that, you know, if you think about the asset processor, there's a bunch of sort of finicky stuff that it's doing. And we have to do it on load, on save and on load, right? So if you come down here and you look at like all of this stuff where it's like doing sort of these different write-outs of where things are, right? Then what happens is in handmade asset.cpp, you've got to do all these sort of fancy reads to pull them out in the right order. That's all. It's all rote. Like there's nothing. The computer doesn't need help for me to do these things. It could just solve that automatically, right? In the same way, just think of it the same way you think of what this is doing. When I say struct HHA sound, I don't ever have to actually do that, right? I could just manually myself have a giant array of U32s and know that like they go sample count, channel count, chain, sample count, channel count, chain, sample, and manually address into the right one to get the sample count, right? I could have done that. But that's just a lot more work and it's a lot more error prone. So having the C compiler know that I am declaring a layout of things that I can then use by name is very handy. What you want it to do is also let you do that for variable size data, but it doesn't, right? And they've started to make a little bit of forward progress into that in recent versions of the spec, but it's still garbage. And so it's just like, whatever. So that's typically where you go metaprogram. You're just like, okay, fine. You don't want to give me a language that works? I'll make my own, right? And you can get really far. You can do a lot in terms of augmenting C to help you make these things trivial without having to take on all the baggage of a higher level language that does a lot of things wrong. Like a Python or something where it's like, forget it, right? But where you could potentially get this thing very easily. How would you make the font tables more sparse so you don't need to store kernings for pairs that probably won't get drawn, like WW? Well, if you want to store a sparse table, you have a lot of ways of doing it. But probably what I'd do is I would just store it as, you know, two binary trees, effectively. You know, well, that might be kind of slow to look up into. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't is the answer, which is why I didn't. Because if you think about it, most, the hardest language we're going to do is maybe is something like Chinese, which doesn't really do kerning. And that we can probably short circuit. So most things that have kerning, pretty much all things that have kerning, have really low letter counts. You know, you're talking about something like 80 glyphs or something. And so a 6400 entry kerning table at 4 bytes apiece is 25K. So like anything you introduce in there is going to be a pretty bad idea, I think. Right? That's like L1 cache size, let alone L2 cache size, is how tiny that is. And you could compress it if you wanted to. You could make it so instead of sorting a float, you stored 16 bits. Would be plenty, right? Canucles, people that follow development of Handmade here on the stream, how will you protect us from spoilers? Unfortunately, I won't. You're going to get spoilered. I think where we landed on that is I'm going to stream the whole development right up to the point where we ship it. Like the day it goes like out of early access or whatever the thing is on Steam, when we hit the like this is now officially version 1, I will stream. And then I think where we landed was I'll then probably do a DLC. or something like that you can add to Handmade Hero that will not be streamed live, so no one will know what's in that. We may do something like that. But in terms of the main game, I want it the whole thing streamed live. That's the point of the project, so you're going to get spoilered. OMG, a giant rock says, you use code point count less than code point, but will this not fail if the first code point is not 0, or will we need to include the ASCII control characters to make control point count work? So, just to be clear, what we will be doing eventually is, I think I mentioned this when I almost typed in the min code point thing, but I don't want to do that yet. What we'll eventually do is store a few ranges of code points. So A will be addressing a bit of a sliding window thing. But the more important thing to realize is that when we deal with this stuff in here, we're eventually going to translate this into a compact code point space, if that makes sense. So we don't want our lookups to be based on Unicode, which has tens of thousands of characters in it, right? What we want to do is base it on the number of glyphs actually in the font. So we're going to do, when we do the language stuff, we're going to do an additional layer that compacts things down. ASCII is already totally compact for the most part. You know, we could store just a couple extra glyphs at the beginning and be fine. But so I wouldn't think too hard about that part yet, because we're just not at the point when that stuff is going to take place. A pet dragon, or a pet rad dragon, a Petra dragon? I don't know. Will you have stream later on various metaprogramming tricks, some useful and nifty tips and tricks for developers? I don't know. Like I said, I'm committed to doing Handmade Hero, but it's a huge commitment, right? I'll be streaming this thing for like 2 years or more, actually, probably more, because I think I said 600 days of coding, and we code only 5 days a week on here. Or I said 600 hours of coding, and we code 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, which means it'll actually be more than 2 years. It'll be like 2.5 years or something, because we don't stream on Sundays. No, Saturdays and Sundays. Which Chinese dialect are you thinking of supporting? Well, to be clear, I was thinking of just supporting all languages, but we just ship with whatever dialect Yangshan speaks or something, as an example. Just so we know we are actually supporting another language properly. But then we just make it so that, you know, I mean, since Handmade Hero is going to be open source, right? Like I said, within 2 years of it shipping, everything will be open sourced, right? That means other people can ship language packs. And furthermore, actually, people could ship language packs right away, because you're allowed, you know, we process all the asset files in the directory at startup, so people could just make their own translations and put them in there probably, right? And so people can port it to languages. It doesn't matter what I ship. We'll be trying to make it so that people who want to translate the game to some other language that's not supported in the official build can just do it without having to like talk to us about it. That would be my hope. eJunkie64, how big do you think the game will be in the end? It will be so huge that no computer can possibly hold it. If a computer tries to run the game, it will collapse into a black hole. Ostravskvlad, how about right-to-left languages? I'm not averse to, I mean, supporting right-to-left languages is super trivial. It's so trivial that I don't even know if the routine changes. The only thing that we have to change is the starting alignment, right? The only thing that changes in the entire code that you've seen so far is this right here. Instead of left edge, use right edge. That's it. That's the only thing. All the rest of our code does not assume a direction, right? Because keep in mind, All of the glyphs have an anchor point. So that anchor point could simply be in the bottom right corner instead of the bottom left corner. And then the kerning table says how far to advance. It would just have negative numbers in it. Done. Right? So the only thing that would have to change is our centering code. That's about it. And that wouldn't be very hard for us to do, so we could do that if people really wanted to. Hey, look at that. We are done with questions right as the stream is over. How is it possible? How are we that perfect? And that's you guys. That's not me. That's all you. You ended the questions right as the stream ended. That is some next level stuff you guys just did, right? That's insane. How do you even do it? In case anyone was wondering who has the best audience on Twitch, I obviously do, because they nailed that ending. And that's not easy considering the lag, right? It's crazy. It's crazy. All right. Let's wind it down. Let's wind it down, folks. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you, as always. We got about halfway through the stuff we want to do with updating our fonts to use kerning tables and also have other good stuff. And I think we'll be able to pretty much get that working tomorrow because we did all the specking of it. We just now have to write the asset flow through, which can be a little finicky at times, but I don't think it should be too hard. So I think by the end of tomorrow, we should be in pretty good shape on our fonts. Pretty good shape. And like I said, from there, I think we might not want to move on immediately. I think we might want to do a little more work just to make sure that we have a plausible story and a plausible story in place for how we support multiple languages, so that we're not kind of caught totally by surprise later when we decide we want to point it to another language and go, oh my God, we've baked in all these assumptions that don't work when you change to Thai or when you change to Hebrew or something. Who knows, right? All right. So that's about it. I hope you will join me tomorrow for the conclusion of this coding. It'll be same place, same time, 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time right here on Twitch. Until then, if you want to play around with the source code, you can always get it by pre-ordering the game on handmadehero.org. And you can go ahead and download the source code every night after I finish working on it and play around with it yourself. Similarly, if you would like to support the video series, you can always support us on Patreon. It's always very much appreciated. We also have a forum site you can go to where you can ask questions and get community contributions like an anti-episode guide and ports to Mac and Linux, good stuff like that. And we have a tweet bot that tweets the schedule at you. I also got most of the GitHub stuff working, I believe. I'm crossing my fingers. I need to do some testing here. And I got to figure out a little bit in terms of their API, like making sure I'm actually handling errors, like rate limiting and stuff correctly, because their API is really janky. So I'm working on that, and so I hope to have an announcement sometime soon that we're in some kind of official beta testing where people besides me are actually playing with it and seeing if it's working in terms of getting authorization. But so stay tuned for that. Maybe later this week, maybe next week, but I'm pretty hopeful that we're getting there. It's been a bit of a grind, but it's getting there. So stay tuned for that. Until then, I will see you guys on the internet. Have fun coding. Take it easy, everyone.